Each time it seemed like the global economy and the Indian economy in particular was poised for a takeoff. We've had some kind of a massive shock, whether it was the pandemic to begin with, the Russia-Ukraine war at this moment, to get a sense of the trajectory of the global economy and the Indian economy from here on. I'm delighted and privileged to be joined at the World Economic Forum once again by Dr. Gita Gopinath, this time in her capacity as the first Deputy Managing Director of the IMF. Thank you so much for your time.
Hi, Ram.
I want your sense at the start of how the Russia-Ukraine war is impacting global growth. Everyone was itching to get back on track after the pandemic, and now we've got this major crisis which confronts and is impacting countries worldwide. So your first sense on the global macroeconomic outlook?
Well, I mean, in April, we downgraded global growth from 4.4% to 3.6%. And that 0.8 percentage point downgrade was almost entirely because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And so it's having highly consequential effects on the global economy. We've downgraded growth for like over 80% of the world. And we have upgraded inflation for almost all of those countries too, because we've had commodity prices going up, food, energy. So cost of living is going up. We are seeing China slow down, China's growth slow down. Most recent numbers showed a very severe hit from the lockdowns, and the real estate sector in China is also slowing. So the combination, we're in a world where growth is weakening and inflation is up, and central bankers are just grappling with this with higher interest rates.
In your view, how do these geopolitical challenges impact the India growth story? Because it seemed for a while that India was poised for a takeoff, setting up for a healthy investment cycle, and then suddenly you have this global shock. So how is this impacting India in your view?
So India came back to its pre-pandemic level of GDP around March of this year, maybe slightly higher, and was continuing to recover. Now, the problem, of course, is India is also an importer of several commodities, and oil prices going up. The concern with coal and the shortages on coal are a major concern for the Indian economy. We continue to see momentum in the recovery. We're seeing this in purchasing manager surveys for manufacturing and for services. But we are also seeing the fact that as the global economy slows, it has consequences for India. We've seen reversals in portfolio flows going into India, like we've seen in other parts of the world. So the external environment is not very supportive for growth at this time.
Let's talk for a moment about China, especially on the back of what's happened in Shanghai with a very long lockdown. To what extent do we have a number in terms of how it's impacting the overall Chinese growth numbers for this year, and how, because of how important China is for the global growth engine, how that's impacting the global growth story?
So for China as another country, we downgraded growth quite significantly in April. We brought it down to around 4.4%. And that was because of the fact that they had far more outbreaks of COVID. They were putting more lockdowns. The lockdowns have now gone from being more targeted to being much more broad-based. And that took a big hit. Retail sales, for instance, took a big hit this April. So I do think that there are serious downside risks to our forecast for China at this point. China has spillovers to the rest of the world. It is a very big part of global trade. And so when China slows down, you see especially countries in the region, Asia, East Asia especially, that get affected negatively by it. Supply chain disruptions are another important factor. One of the reasons that has fed inflation around the world. And this is going to continue because of that. But even countries in Europe, like Germany, that are manufacturing hubs and that trade a lot with China, are going to face the spillover from China slowing down.
But it's a tough spot from a policy perspective because they've taken a zero COVID stance. And you've written a lot on how the world should end the pandemic and get out of it. What's your sense of the kind of policy maneuvers Xi Jinping and the Chinese leadership are practicing, and how could this impact China's growth from here on?
So the zero COVID strategy of China served it very well. I mean, to be clear, in 2020 and 21, it was an economy that had very targeted lockdowns, was able to bring back activity extremely quickly. Now, of course, we're grappling with a whole new variant, which is far more transmissible. And so the question is, what does one do at this point? Vaccinations remain the best hope for dealing with this pandemic. If you look at the recent science on China's vaccines, it takes about 3 shots to get protection against severe disease and death. And if you look at the population in China, or if you look at those people above the age of 80, only 20% have had 3 shots. So there is a real trade-off, which is that if you open up, that you could end up with many more deaths. The strategy then has to be to ramp up the vaccination, especially the 3rd dose, to as many people as they can. Then afterwards, which they can remove these restrictions that they have right now, which are really quite strict.
The pandemic brought out the challenges of having a supply chain that's very dependent on China. And one of the hopes, at least in India, was that with the China plus one model, there's a possibility that some part of global manufacturing, as it moves out of China, could start coming towards India. In the conversations that you're having and the data that you're studying, do you think India has gone as far as it should have or could have in capitalizing on that opportunity?
I mean, this has always been the pivot that one expected to see. Even without the pandemic, the cost of production has gone up in China. So you would expect to see some of the manufacturing move outside of China. And other countries have benefited from it. India has benefited also from increasing its exports. But at the same time, there are still some barriers that need to be fixed. And these are more like policies at home, also in terms of ports and infrastructure, being able to do just-in-time manufacturing and delivery. I mean, all of that requires a lot of investment, and we go back to the standard set of reforms that are needed, be it on labor market, be it building up on, business environment and so on. So all of those will need to continue. But yes, this is a moment to be able to seize, to be able to make the...
So merchandise exports in India up in a big way, and the government's, because of the production-linked incentive schemes, hoping that a lot of manufacturing will start coming into India, or some of it they're already beginning to see. You spoke of more reforms that are required. Can you spell those out for us in terms of going beyond what the government has already delivered on? What would you individually and the IMF like to see?
The important thing to be a big part of the global supply chain is to be able to produce at very big scale. And that has always been a challenge for the Indian economy. Yes, you have some firms that are able to produce at large scale, but the vast majority of them are smaller in size. They don't employ those many people. They produce at small scale. So policies that can generate a bigger, can encourage scale is one important measure, but that requires the same reforms on land and labor, which has been taking time to happen in India. I think infrastructure is going very well in terms of the investment that they've seen, and even the recent projects are all very good. So pushing on that front would be very important. Becoming a part of trade agreements, I think that still has to be a priority, which is India is engaging with the world. Putting too many restrictions on imports of goods hampers your ability to then use the inputs that you need to export out of the country. So that's another area where I think India could make, could move on.
You spoke of tariff barriers. Not just is it happening in India, it seems to be a global phenomenon. Do you see the pandemic accelerating the trend towards not necessarily the end of globalization, but a reconfiguration of globalization where countries put their national interests first, especially given the fact that you have populist regimes in so many different countries?
Well, we're certainly seeing more restrictions go up. I mean, even India with its export restrictions on wheat, we're seeing around 30 countries that since the start of the war have put export restrictions of some kind on food and energy and other key commodities. This is a huge problem for the global economy and for the global recovery. We need a way to deal with this. We need to increase supply of all of these products and not restrict it. And that is a major problem. In terms of the more broader trend, we are concerned about fragmentation, which is that even if global trade doesn't necessarily come down, that the world becomes more fragmented into geo-economic and geopolitical blocks. And that also has deep consequences, because we know that when you have technological decoupling, when you have an increase in trade policy uncertainty, we've estimated the effects on world GDP are quite large. We are certainly concerned about this, but the whole point, I guess, of fora like this, the World Economic Forum also, is that we bring together different stakeholders so that we can be in conversation and just remind each other about the benefits of integration.
But Russia isn't here. China only marginally represented. Therefore, what's your view on this growing concern that the world could be fragmenting at least into two blocks. One is the Chinese-Russian bloc and say another bloc led by America.
I don't think we have to take it as a given that would happen. What is clearly the case is that companies around the world, countries are concerned about resilience, about the fact that we had the pandemic and your supply chain breakdowns that came from it. Now you have the war, the security risks associated with trading partners. So countries are going to try to build resilience. Companies are going to try to build resilience. That requires diversifying your production across more countries than you've done in the past. I think this is also an opportunity for India in that sense, because India becomes a market in which they can diversify too. But what we should avoid is creating trade policy that is going to then fragment the world, generate high levels of uncertainty, and, we lose the gains. I don't think that train has left the station yet. So we need to make sure that doesn't happen.
What's your outlook on inflation in India and globally? We've seen in India the government cut excise duty quite sharply in a hope to bring fuel prices down. Is that going to be just temporary relief given the tailwinds that we're seeing?
Inflation in India, the most recent numbers, 7.8%. That would be now the third month in a row where inflation is above the band of 4 to 6%. So I think it was right that the RBI moved off cycle and raised interest rates. It will most likely need to continue to do that going forward. Do you have an estimate of
how much the interest rates could or should rise by?
I think there's so much uncertainty about the impact of what we're seeing around the world on India's growth that, it's not a prediction I would make at this point. But like all central bankers are doing, which is to be very data dependent and to move flexibly and in scale with the data that's coming in, right? That you don't want to be too little. So I think that's what, of course, RBI also is doing and what they should continue to do. Yes, and another feature that we're seeing in India and in other countries is this cut in excise duties and giving additional subsidies in fertilizer and food and so on. I mean, the main trade-off, of course, is you have to keep in mind the fact that fiscal deficits are quite large. Many countries have high levels of debt. So there's only that much fiscal space to provide these kinds of support measures. The best way to do it is, frankly, to provide targeted transfers to poor households and extremely vulnerable businesses. That's the first best way to do it. Now, there are challenges in doing it in that particular way, which is why you see governments just simply cutting taxes.
You've been speaking about this for a while. It now seems from some of the reportage that's come out of India that the government's warming up to the idea of income benefit transfers to those who need it the most. That you still believe is the most effective policy intervention?
That is certainly the most effective and non-distortive way, and also friendly to your fiscal situation in dealing with the kinds of price increases, the kinds of shocks that we're seeing
Are there other things India could do or other countries can do to try and tame the inflation racket?
I think what countries in India can do, which is a big wheat producer, is increase supply.
So you're still pushing for India to export?
It would be great if countries like India were to incentivize more production of wheat. I think that would be
I spoke to Piyush Goyal yesterday, our Minister for Commerce and Industry, and the point he made was we have to put national interest first. We had a massive heat wave. Wheat production came down. We can't have a situation where Indians are starving, while of course we'll keep our commitments, but we can't have a situation where our people suffer.
To that, I would say that the way you prevent your people from suffering, it's the poor who suffer in such circumstances. And again, it would be the cash transfer route that one would go to make those, to be able to have them, for them food to be affordable, right? On the other hand, we would like India's farmers to be able to benefit from the rising prices and to be able, and therefore then incentivize them to produce more. So I think that's the ideal way to do it. But that said, I understand that there are constraints on how effectively to do all of this.
Agrarian reform in India got derailed because of the massive farmer protests that we saw. Is that something that you were disappointed with? You were pushing for farm reforms, even if this wasn't the full package, but it was a step in the right direction?
We certainly see a need for reforms in the agricultural sector in India in terms of raising productivity, raising incomes at that level too. I mean, there are many reforms that are needed. Of course, one has to get the political support for it to make it happen. But that's one area. But in addition to that, if I may just pivot to the fact that I think schooling and education is probably another area where a lot of attention is needed. In this pandemic, schools were closed for a long period of time. Lost learning, big hit to human capital. And I think that really needs to be rectified.
We've seen a meltdown in the crypto markets, especially when it comes to some stable coins and a fall in crypto prices. In India, trading volumes come down because of taxation imposed by the government. What's your sense of how this space is likely to evolve? Because many young people watching you would be deeply disappointed with the tax that the government has put and that UPI can no longer be used for crypto trading. And that seems, given how they were excited about crypto trading, that seems to be a big bummer for them.
I think everybody should just recognize the fact that crypto assets are an extremely risky speculative asset class. It's gone from being a $3 trillion market to $1.5 trillion market in about 6 months. So it's very quick moves. It's not a panacea. It's not like an easy return investment. So there are very large risks you are taking. And with any risky asset, there has to be regulation.
So how do you look at crypto personally? Would you ever, have you invested even $1 in it, or you stay away completely?
I've stayed away completely, but that's just me and my level of risk aversion.
Between coming here in winter, in January, when it's snowing and everyone's slipping, to coming now when it's a bit hot in this suit, which one do you prefer and which one's working well for you?
Well, I prefer warmer weather, so.
You prefer warmer weather?
I prefer warmer
weather.
This
goes against the idea of being here in Davos. Everyone's talking about climate change and how hot it is being here at this time.
This is summer. It's supposed to be warm.
This has been an interesting conversation. I see your mind has got a hand going, so we're out of time. Lots of more questions, but we'll leave it for another day. Gita Gopinath, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
If you like the video, do like, comment, share and subscribe.